Okay, hi. So I guess two-thirds of the room know me. So for the other third of the room, so my name's Rebecca, and I'm doing a part-time PhD at the Royal College of Art and V&A on the History of Design programme. And I'm going into my last year, potentially a little bit longer than that, but hopefully last year. So my presentation today, Folk Fever and the Bureaucratic Machine, Karel Kosík's Moravská Hellas, 1963. It focuses on a section from my second chapter, which is centred around a film, Moravská Hellas, or Moravian Hellas, which was made by Czech New Wave filmmaker Karel Kosík in 1963. The film was a critical response to the centralisation of folk, culture and crafts by the socialist state. Today it will provide a platform from which this wider area can be discussed and analysed. I'm using it as a form of representation and criticality in the context of the craft and design discourse. And I come at this as a design historian rather than a film historian, so I'll be very interested to gain any kind of new insight from any of you that perhaps takes it outside of that category a bit. So, last year, an important contemporary Czech scholar and curator, Láďa Hubatová-Vacková, and her colleagues organised an exhibition entitled Things and Words in Brno, and it accompanied an anthology of Czech and Czechoslovak applied art and design history and theory writing from 1870 to 1970. It had taken 4 years to assemble, and if you want to know more about it, I've written a review of the exhibition anthology which is about to come out in West's 86th journal. But the reason I refer to it today is primarily to look at this image. The exhibition was made up of objects from across the 100-year period, divided into 3 sections of time, and the exhibition was designed by contemporary artist Eva Koťáčková, who is interested in the archive, assemblages of objects and associated narratives. A series of posters were created for the exhibition based on her assemblages, and this is one of them. And I see it as a useful visual analogy for historical perspective and, in many ways, my research methodology, where objects that can help locate answers to research questions overlap and are held in a kind of tension with one another. In so doing, they create a kind of lens through which I hope to gain understanding. They also denote the complexity of my untangling sources that are often part of official communist discourse and rhetoric, and alongside this I'm doing it in a second language. I'm not a completely fluent Czech speaker, and so yes, I've created quite a complex situation, but one that's never-endingly interesting. My PhD research looks primarily at craft as a means of accessing the complex role of making in a centralised state context, specifically Czechoslovakia during its period of communist government from the late 1940s to the 1980s. And I'm using a range of case studies that include ceramics, glass, textiles and film as a means of mapping the maker and the maker's context. In using these varying forms, my methodology is to analyse spectrums and relationships between handwork and industry, from sites of production such as the studio and the factory in the context of state-organised projects and institutions. And in so doing, I hope to answer the question of whether Czechoslovak socialist modernity can be defined as a series of tensions between certain characteristics of craft, such as authenticity, individualization, the handmade, and a typically Soviet communist attempt to create a design science in the forms of ergonomics, didactic advice for living, and quantifiable measures. What I want to know is, where did the individual maker and their creativity find a place in this often contradictory context? And in particular relevance to Karel Kosík's film that we'll look at today, where did points of conflict and tension arise in the centralised economy driven by ideological and quantitative demands, and what do they tell us about the role of making and design under communism in Czechoslovakia? So the title for today's talk, Folk Fever and the Bureaucratic Machine, comes from an amalgamation of a statement from one of the characters in Moravská Hellas and a quote from Czech neo-Marxist philosopher Karel Kosík. Kosík's influential text, The Dialectics of the Concrete, was published in 1963, the year in which this film was made. The latter was a popular text that came out in several editions and one that Kosík himself read. The first part of the title of this talk, Folk Fever, refers to when folk storyteller Uncle Liblice, pictured here, discusses ethnographic practice in the film. He says, "So today, in my old age, I'm bored by it. I see it now as some kind of fever, no more a kind of creativity. It's more for those people who wish to profit from it." Liblice is a voice of truth and reason in Karel Kosík's part reportage, part fiction parody of state folk art and music events centred around the 1963 Strasnice annual folk festival. Liblice's feelings about the categorization and commodification of folk products and practices are part of what can be seen as a wider cultural sickness at the time, a fatigue resulting from the drawn-out process of de-Stalinisation in Czechoslovakia, economic hardship, general disillusionment with state control of life, and the emptiness, or the proved emptiness, of socialist dreams. The film can be seen as both a form of resistance to and questioning of the systematization of folk and creative practices epitomised by the ethnographic approaches of centralised state organisations, which categorise the boundaries of folk art and craft, to be discussed further. 1963, when the film was made, was also the year when this fever was perhaps breaking, not so much a slow, cold thaw as a rapidly surfacing disturbance, a restlessness in the long shadow of Khrushchev's 1956 secret speech denouncing Stalinism. And this was not only seen in Czech New Wave films like Moravská Helles, but also in contemporary Czech philosophy and discussions around literature and art in the early 1960s. And this leads us to the second part of the title of this paper, The Bureaucratic Machine. Writer and academic Vladimir Kusin, when writing in 1971 about the bureaucratic grip of socialist Czechoslovakia in the late 1950s, declared it a tidal wave of physical and mental strain, describing the toll of the centralised bureaucratic machine. It is perhaps of no surprise in this context that Kafka's writing came under scrutiny. The year of Moravská Helles, 1963, was also would have been Kafka's 80th birthday. And upon this occasion, a Kafka conference was held in Liblice in Czechoslovakia, hosted by the Czech Academy of Arts, who invited leading Marxist critics and philosophers from across the Eastern Bloc to discuss Kafka's relevance to socialist societies. The work of Kafka and its role in the Soviet Union and satellite nations was deeply examined in the context of ongoing debates around theoretical Marxism, revisionism, early Marx, and alienation. The aforementioned book by Kosík, Dialectics of the Concrete, was part of this debate. The Kafka conference has been explored in detail by writers like David Bathrick in 1995, František Kaupman, 2003, Martin Reimann, 2003, Martin Ondřes in 2008, and most relevant to this discussion, Peter Hames in his 2014 essay, Alienated Heroes, Marxism and the Czechoslovak New Wave. Hames's article offers a reading of Czech New Wave cinema through the lens of contemporary philosophy. And Hames refers to contemporary philosopher Karel Kosík, who in this context of questioning in 1963 asked, "What is the Kafkaesque world? Is it the world of absurdity, of human thoughts and action, of human dreams, a world of monstrous and unintelligible labyrinth, a world of human powerlessness in the network of bureaucratic machines, mechanisms, reified creations?" Švejkism is a way of reacting to this world of absurd omnipotence of the machine and of reified relations. So here we have the bureaucratic machine cited in the talk's title. And Hames discusses this quotation in relation to Czech New Wave cinema in general, but I think it applies particularly well to Hašek's Moravská Helles. It most certainly is a world in the film of absurdity and human powerlessness, of which Kafka and Jaroslav Hašek, author of The Good Soldier Švejk, would surely approve. So Švejkism, written between 1921 and 1923, as you probably know, the tales of Švejk are set in Austria-Hungary and satirise the Habsburg authorities. Švejk repeatedly falls into mishaps and appears highly incompetent, frustrating military authorities. The question hovering over the text is of whether he is as useless as he appears, or if his idiocy is a form of effective passive protest. In the same way, the structures of authority and control imposed by communist authorities in Czechoslovakia are questioned by Hašek through the absurd antics of festival participants and craftspeople depicted in his 1963 film. We can accurately apply Kosík's general idea of Švejkism to Moravské Hele's film. As Hames discusses, his book Dialectics of the Concrete had far-reaching effect on Czech culture. Hames' reasoning is that it was published in several editions, which sold out every time. And Hames also corroborates the assertion of Vladimir V. Kusin, who, when writing about the intellectual origins of the Prague Spring, he outlined the public debate that had taken place between Kosík and fellow Marxist humanist philosopher Ivan Švejk in the popular publication Literární noviny during 1956 and 57. Hames argues that the ideas promoted by such philosophers impacted Czech New Wave filmmaking, part of the general movement in both Marxist thinking and culture of putting man at the centre again in the early 1960s. To illuminate his meaning, Hames refers again to philosopher Švejk, who argued, above all, we must believe in ourselves, in our experience of what life around us is like. I interviewed Karel Kosík, the maker of the film, a few weeks ago, and he agreed that this philosophical context was impactful, and he had indeed read Kosík, who made this statement. He also told me that he'd been reading Sartre and a great deal of other literature, but it seems perhaps one of the most resonant statements originating from the philosopher was this emphasis on Švejkism. Hašek later proclaimed in an interview in 2004 that Hašek is the key, though he may not have realised this in the 1960s. The absurdity of Moravské Hele shows this kind of connection and poignancy. So that's to give you a context for the title of this paper, some wider ideas of the 1963 context. Before we go further in analysing the film and looking at it in more detail, I'd like to look at what kind of craft and design activities the film was responding to, which took place in the time period leading up to 1963, through a brief visit to some of the other case studies which are included in earlier sections of my research. One of the themes that Hašek deals with is the idea of fragmentation and its related concept of juxtaposition. The juxtaposition of images is used in Moravské Hele, as we see here, showing a spectrum of sort of typical socialist activity, which ranges from the idealization of folk activities on the right to the pursuit of science, as we see in images on the left, both in areas such as the Cold War space race and the attempt to make science of everyday life via approaches such as ergonomics in the home and measuring out life in the style of Taylorist approaches to factory management. Hašek's juxtapositioning also underlines the ways in which state-organised craft and design pursuits could just highlight areas they felt useful to the socialist narrative, such as peasant folk culture, potentially without critical or meaningful integration, which is what the film largely deals with. So, for example, a site of design which this kind of juxtaposition might be seen to take place is within socialist realism in Czechoslovakia, so particularly looking at the late 1940s and into the 50s, in which national vernacular motifs were used to reiterate ideology. One example are these two buildings in Tabor, used as an illustration in an 18-page article in Architectura Czechoslovakia in 1951 on socialist realist architecture, showing proposals for T-series contemporary buildings, but decorated with vernacular motifs. So we see here on the left a 15th century tower in Tabor and a T-series building in Tabor with the same vernacular town detail being used. Architectural historian Kimberly Elman-Zareko asserts that as an industrialized nation in the late 1940s and early 1950s, Czechoslovakia focused on formal strategies that allowed the appearance of the acceptance of Soviet ideas around socialist realism, whilst not losing their own architectural aims. The Czech and Slovak vernacular folk tradition allowed for this. Zdeněk Lakomý, the head of the Stavo Project Building Research Initiative, established in autumn 1948 as the Nationalized Institute for Architectural Practice, advocated standardized housing units that derived architectural details from regional traditions. Lakomý stated that the key to socialist realism in Czechoslovakia was the dialectical synthesis of typification and creativity. Lakomi, incidentally, was a key figure who allegedly is the la in the pejorative Czech name for socialist realism, sore la, socialistický realismus Lakomi, though the alternative interpretation is that it came from a brand of pomade or shoe polish popular in the interwar years. But whatever the term's origins, this architectural development is a good example of sorella and shows how it functioned as a dialogue between local narratives and Soviet socialist realist directives as a kind of form of recontextualization. But another reading is that it functions as a kind of meaningless quoting, a layering of motifs to utilize folk as an ideological tool, and as such it suggests the origins of the kind of work which by 1963 caused the exhaustion and despair in the emptiness of making that inspired a film like Moravska Helles. But I also believe that perhaps in emphasizing this, Hašek underestimated the dialogue existing between ideas of folk, craft making and the state. Whilst I agree that, of course, the restrictions of socialist realism and Stalinism were obviously deeply problematic and extremely dangerous, there were also active thinking debates that did not merely juxtapose folk and craft tropes in order to gain points with the party. And one such state organisation I'm looking at in my research was ULUV, the Centre for Folk Art and Production. ULUV was established in October 1945 through one of President Beneš's decrees, number 110, to organise folk and artistic production. The decree was one of the infamous number of decrees he issued, mostly when he was president in exile in London during World War II. And the decrees actually remain a contested part of Czech and Slovak history, as they dealt largely with the eviction of ethnic Germans from Czechoslovakia, and meaning their citizenship and property was removed. And the decrees caused doubts as to whether the Czech Republic should be allowed into the EU in the run-up to 2004. Decree 110 was created, quote, in order to ensure the healthy development of prerequisites of folk and artistic production, end quote, and attempted to harness support cottage industry through the centralised membership of small-scale applied art manufacturers and workshops. These were divided into umělecko řemesla, artistic handicraft, and umělecko průmysl, the artistic industrial producers, Czech terms that featured throughout the following 20 years. Membership of ULUV was decided upon by a central managing presidium according to reports to the Ministry of Industry. And criteria for membership was based on working in small scale, from home or a workshop with an emphasis on cottage industry and the handmade in a collective manner. Specific materials and modes of making were not specified in the decree, but it did state that artistic handicraft and artistic industrial production means the production of objects with artistic standards or expressing distinctive creative activities. The decree shows how handicraft, small industry and folk production were combined as virtues in 1945 Czechoslovak context to increase and support production in the aftermath of Nazi occupation. But the continuation of ULUV as an organisation and related organisations through the communist period show how certain ideas of integrated craft and design were maintained despite political transitions. ULUV's adherence to the virtues of small-scale, handcrafted production and folk values shows the influence of modernist notions of idealising the primitive. The related idea of the positive association of peasant culture under Stalinism and the similar allocation of meaning for folk in the context of socialist modernity offers insight into how these precepts originated in the Czechoslovak context. In the case of ULUV, such ideas also had their origins in interwar developments, which were directly fed into the foundations of ULUV by the involvement of Josef Vidra, an industrial designer, ethnographer, pedagogue, theorist and historian of folk art. According to historian Hubatova Vatskova, Vidra was discussing folk art as a prototype for modern design as early as 1925, not only with an interest in clean lines, simplified forms and natural materials that could be adapted to standardized production, but also as a sociological response to the movement of people from country to towns during this time, as a means of providing for the new urban proletariat. Vidra took an active part in defining ULUV, outlining in magazine Tvar, Shape, in 1949, that it was necessary to find a happy medium between the folk and the modern. ULUV's workshops were run at this time by Vidra's associate Vladimir Bocek, who with Vidra was influenced by the folk influence yet modern Scandinavian style, which for both men meant a kind of happy medium, as it meant the modern was rusticated whilst folk was elevated. Hubatova Vatskova notes that this dynamic continued through to the 1960s. There were more conservative ethnographers within Ulov who emphasised historical imitation, but Vidra and his associated colleagues always pushed for new forms rather than just imitating folk forms, a national romanticism that he viewed as kitsch. These ideas were continued in much of the work of Ulov and its companion organisation established in 1956, the Centre for Artistic Crafts. So it was, as such, a critical dialogue, often based on and stemming from guild structures, studios and theoretical notions of interwar and earlier developments around craft and design. And it's perhaps this kind of criticality that doesn't have a place in Hašek's Moravské Hellas. As mentioned, folk was often bound to modernist developments and as such was used by some to defend the continuation of modernist forms under socialism. One example that I look at in my research is an exhibition called Umění a kitsch, Art and Kitsch, which took place in 1948 and presented modern art from Czechoslovakia, arguing that its relationship to folk methods and forms, denoting a localized proletarian culture, made it relevant for socialist Czechoslovakia, whilst separating it from kitsch. The exhibition took place in Brno and was curated by František Venera, who was intrinsically linked to the Czech modernist movement, a well-known art collector and former secretary of the group of graphic artists in Brno. It's of little surprise then that the exhibition set out to show a valid place for Czech modernism in post-World War II socialist Czechoslovakia. He presented Czechoslovak modernism as firmly connected to folk forms, a relationship which denoted authenticity and an appropriate connection to the needs of every man. This duality would also, argued Venera, suppress the decadent visual trash, as he called it, of kitsch that threatened a socialist state. As well as a fine art selection, the exhibition featured examples of folk and applied art from Moravia, the home of folk culture, where Moravské Hellas was also filmed. And the exhibition incorporated examples of work from the Ulov showroom. For Venera, this was a means of rejecting the ballast, by which he meant kitsch, which he viewed as plaguing contemporary culture. In this, he's not far from Hašek in 1963, who would agree that this idea of kitsch was ballast, but he would cite the folk objects being made by state organisations as being that. Venera's exhibition took place 4 months after the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia gained power, and shortly before their party's General Congress in 1949, when socialist realism was cemented as the official style. Indeed, Venera's would be one of the last of exhibitions of modern artists until a groundbreaking exhibition in the same location, the House of Art in Brno, nearly 10 years later in 1957. It's only in the early 1960s that the discussion of modernism truly becomes public once more in Czechoslovakia. The exhibition highlights that there was an active ongoing debate around meaning in art, craft and design, central to which was this idea of kitsch. This is what Hašek sees as being produced in Stražnica, where he bases the film Moravské Hellas. The debate stemmed all the way from avant-garde writer and theoretician Karel Kosík, who had written about art and kitsch in the 1930s. And in the socialist modern context, this became a debate about taste. So, for example, this series in the magazine Domov, an interiors and living magazine produced in 1960, this feature, Pantomime in Bad Taste, was produced by UBOC, another important institution in my research, the Institute of Housing and Fashion Culture, and showed the debates around whether objects are of good or bad taste in the home. And not just Ulov and local folk objects were being used as a means of discussing authenticity and individuality in the home, but also international folk objects or vernacular traditions, which were cited as examples of industrial meeting points between local traditions and larger scale production. Here we see objects from the Far East and Russia being positioned against objects from the West. So we've got an example of a kind of capitalist interior on the right, as it is called. Though Domov magazine also featured detailed and complementary articles on Scandinavian design and craft, as well as the activities of the London Design Centre. So that's to give you an idea of the context in which Moravské Hellas appears. So now, for 1963, we'll watch the short trailer for the film. Oh. It's transferred on here, but not on there.
Stříbro na starých fotografiích vyšisoval. A dnešní folklor je jaksi anachronismem. Folklorní slavnosti, strážnice, moravská Hellas.
Kluci sa z krojov smejú, ale ja v kroji rád chodím. Ja v tom robím aj lidového vypráviača. Menujem sa Lebánek.
Zavedu vás na chvíľečku k nám na Moravské Slovácko.
Vo vyševackej škole sme 4 žiačky. S riaditeľkou, učiteľkou, školníčkou, dokopy 7 ľudí.
Nahradila som jednu z žiačok preto, aby sme mohli niektoré veci tu presnejšie vyjadriť.
Ja ti ukážem, ešte takú mám peknú knižku. Ukážem to tvojej mamice, aby videli, jak ja umiem malovať. To má ministerstva kultúry. Dvoječka tu malujú na žebříčku vylezená na kapličce. Oni to dali, aké je to velice pekné, to sa do toho futíva. To je tak pekné, tá kniha.
Interview hotovo. Ono to není lehký, sečta. Sociologický průzkum. Strážnice 1963. A dnešní folklor je taky jaksi vyšisovaný.
So that's the trailer. So doesn't have that on here. Thank you. So, the film takes the form of a tour of the town and its festival. A small sewing school, as we saw, is visited, the house of a woman who paints folk motifs on the exterior and interior of her home. We saw her showing the camera her book of examples from the Ministry of Culture. Storytellers tell stories, musicians play, and folk dancers sing and dance. Visitors from all over the world came to the festival, and we can see in this trailer a group of men in Arab dress who were there that year. The film gathers momentum and ruptures around the drunken antics of what were earlier neat and presentable folk performers at the festival. The film acts like a microcosm of delusion, where the characters in the grand socialist plot have to let their fever break via alcohol and confusion. It's a kind of King Lear storm to expose the nonsense and tragedy of the situation. And when I interviewed Karel Kosík about the film, he confirmed his admiration for Shakespeare and indeed King Lear. The truth-speaking character of Uncle Labyrinth becomes in this context the fool. But foolishness without wisdom also characterises many of the craftspeople depicted in the film. They make objects only because they're wanted by the tourists, they carry out motions without meaning. I asked Hašek if this was symbolic of the system itself turning people into dulled versions of themselves, or whether he had really admired or disliked their making abilities. His response was in a kind of romantic tradition. He claimed that they were not artists because they did not have genius, not, he continued, like someone like William Blake. But he continued that in fact the key message was more than this, that they were made idiotic by the context in which they were forced to play, actors in a badly written play. He explained, the thing that looks like a festival of art is actually a conglomeration of the unhappy fates of people who are tasked to present themselves as artists, when they are not artists at all and do not know what art is. In this respect, he deprives them of any true connection to their making, which is complicated to assess without access to the real people depicted in the film. Though one thing that is known is that Uncle Labyrinth, who we saw, called his performances at the festival pseudo-socialistitsky songs, performing them just as a side income to please the authorities alongside his real vocation, which was farming. Moravské Helles and its folk craft making and singing characters may appear amusing and absurd, but there's also a very dark undercurrent of state criticism, which was felt and feared by the authorities. The festival is interrogated by two investigative reporters, Karel and Jan Soudek, who we saw, later in real life a well-known comic draftsman and photographer, respectively, and they wander the town with a camera and microphone. The role of craft making and folk reference was important political territory, and by criticising it through these characters, Hašek was criticising a much wider socialist narrative, one that used vernacular peasant culture as a means of communicating, as we've seen in the previous examples, the wholesome authenticity of communist life. Such a device we have most clearly seen in socialist realism during the late 1940s and 50s, but was more subtly continued in an integrated form via the development of socialist craft and design through centralised institutions that lent on folk and craft language to create this theme of authentic making, as we saw through Ulov. What this means in practical terms is that often the local practices were inserted into the state framework, and this became a form of recontextualization that people like historian Nicolette Makovitsky have discussed in relation to state-organized lace production in Slovakia, and Dima Kanev in relation to the state control of tradition via folklore-related activities such as festivals and local museums. Kanev proposes that this method of recontextualizing traditional techniques in the socialist narrative was a way of owning the past, using traditions and rituals as elements to support a narrative of cooperative production and therefore supporting the supposed march to a better socialist future. Moravské Helles, unpacking all of these kind of themes, had a mixed response. It did receive an honourable mention at the annual film festival in Karlovy Vary in 1964, but caused then a furore that resulted in it being removed from cinema circulation for several years. Such a reaction also shows quite how poignant the use of Stražnica, where the film was set, was as a vehicle for criticising the state. The festival itself had been criticised by reviewer František Pokorný in 1961 as made up of illusionistic pursuits and unsuccessful vaudeville stereotypes. Hašek's incisive exposure of this side of the festival, presenting idiocy at institutional and personal levels, while simultaneously creating an empathetic portrait of human and individual fallibility, was surely a dangerous combination amidst the supposedly perfect and collective environment of socialism. Karel Kosík went on to make one of the most insightful films about latter events, a seminal reportage film, Elective Affinities, documenting President Novotny's resignation in March 1968 as Ludvík Svoboda became leader alongside First Secretary Alexander Dubček. That film captured the political machinations running up to the Soviet and Warsaw Pact military invasion 5 months later. A subtle and fascinating uncovering of the everyday governmental processes during this time, the film's name was based on that of the 1809 novel by Goethe, a scientific term, elective affinities, describing the tendency of chemical species to combine with certain substances or species in preference to others, a metaphor for human relations. Moravské Helles is a reference to a statement supposedly made by sculptor August Rodin when he visited Moravia in 1902 to visit Czech national artist Joža Uprka, when Rodin commented that the area reminded him of ancient Greece. The title therefore connotes the state idealization of Moravia as an idyll of peasant culture, whilst surely playfully implying that the situation has become some kind of hellish joke. The villagers often appear idiotic and materialistic, victims of the diktats from centralized institutions, the bosses from Prague, as one of the older residents of Stražnica calls them in the film, as well as often of their own nostalgia. Hašek's emphasis on disillusion within the state system stemmed from personal experience. He created Moravské Helles while temporarily expelled from the Prague Film Academy and working as a manual worker in Zlin. Given his geographical location nearby, it makes sense that Hašek's malcontent with the system found its expression in the nearby town of Stražnica, where Moravské Helles was set, which is located in the far east of Czech Moravia. By 1963, this town was synonymous with folk song and dance due to the establishment of the festival there in 1946, and the reputation was both national and international. From 1948, the festival was added to the new Communist Party of Czechoslovakia's list of events of national interest, and was as such coordinated and organised by party representatives. By the late 1950s and first half of the 1960s, interest in more mainstream music and dance had begun to undermine the dominance of folklore, a development that causes in the film older women in Moravské Helles to worry that their younger neighbours would forsake folk dress for the alluring new products such as makeup and hair dye. And there's a nice juxtaposition in this scene of a kind of younger woman in a more fashionable dress juxtaposed against the folk performers in the background. Hašek's criticism would also have been particularly poignant in the political and economic context of 1963, during what political scientist H. Gordon Skilling has called a deepening crisis. In the aftermath of the 22nd Congress of Communist Party of Soviet Union in October 1961, where Khrushchev had reiterated his criticism of Stalin, the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia had to demonstrate alignment with de-Stalinization. In a bid to avoid crises like those in Budapest or Warsaw, Antonin Novotny's government laid blame on earlier leader Klement Gottwald and the cult of personality, opening up a re-examination of the controversial 1952 Slansky show trial, which had resulted in the hanging of 13 party members. In 1962, key ministers from the early 1950s, including Rudolf Barak, were dismissed, and the 15 by 22 metre statue of Stalin, designed by sculptor Otakar Svet, who killed himself the day before its unveiling in 1955, was destroyed. Novotny was re-elected by a unanimous vote of the National Assembly at the end of 1964, but the foundations by this point were fundamentally disturbed and would crumble in 1968 when his leadership ended. Economically, the distorted effects of centralised planning were becoming evident during this time as well. The national income fell between 1962 and 1963. There were shortages in consumer goods. The government held back information on the economic situation until announcing in 1962 that the newly commenced 5-year plan was to be abandoned in favour of a reactive 1-year plan to address the most immediate problems. The duplicitous nature of party manoeuvres were often most actively commented on by literary circles in Czechoslovakia, those writers that the Nobel Prize-winning avant-garde writer Jaroslav Seifert had in 1956 famously called the conscience of the nation. The early 1960s demonstrative removals of traces of Stalin simply placed opaque layers of shifting political allegiance on top of one another. This tactic was later allegorized by author Josef Skvoretzky in his novel The Miracle Game, set in the late 1960s. He describes the main street of the small town of Hranov, quote, which over the past 30 years has been named after Edvard Beneš, Frederick the Great, Stalin, Lenin, Professor Nejedly, Thomas Masaryk, and finally, once more, Lenin, unquote. The confusion of images, voices, and objects layered on top of one another in Moravské Helles similarly questioned the nature of historical distortion. 1963 was a year when writer congresses were important places of political ferment, condemning socialist realist representatives such as Václav Kopecký, Jaroslav Stoll, and pointing out that art was hampered. In the same year, a campaign against dissident writing was launched by the Central Committee, particularly criticising cultural periodicals, while the latter launched a counterattack defending their need for a critical outlook. Censorship continued, but a very gradual freeing of expression took place. In art, this shifting was taking place too, and had been since the late 1950s. Articles like Art and Reality, written by key Czech art critic and historian Jindřich Kouplecký in 1957 for Fine Art magazine, criticised pre-formulated artistic programs as making artistic creation impossible. 1963 was, to use another metaphor, not just time when fever was breaking, but the year leading up to the point when, according to anthropologist Jaroslav Hašek, the dam finally burst. In 1964, Stalinists quickly lost power in artistic circles, and Kouplecký was made chairman of the Art Union, reinstating those who'd been discriminated against, reducing censorship on exhibitions, exhibiting abroad, and giving scholarships irrespective of political opinion. This was the time of a kind of awakening that would lead to the thawing of the 1960s that would end so tragically with the invasion of the troops in 1968. Marxist humanist philosopher Ivan Svitak, who we referred to earlier, spoke as this time of philosophers being awakened from a dogmatic doze. This brings us back to this idea of illusion and the fragmentation of reality which is associated with this idea of folk fever. Public debates such as those held at the 1963 Kafka conference allowed these concepts and those of bureaucracy and alienation, so unthinkable for discussion in Stalinist Czechoslovakia, to be discussed. Historian David Barthick has observed that the breakthrough of modernism and a critical discourse about modernization in the 1960s brought with it a fragmenting and pluralizing of cultural expression, thematically as well as aesthetically. Such a fragmentation meant an exploration of the crisis of the individual, evacuated and reconvened notions about the real, about socialism, and this connects to this idea of searching for reality we see in Hašek's Moravska Hellas. Hašek implodes the idea of the perfect folk festival and its dutiful participants, and showed the state that the ridiculous side of their control and dissemination of national and local narratives. In so doing, he questioned the crisis of the individual in the socialist context. Official design discourse continued to try and create a meaningful relationship between craft folk and the vernacular and socialist modernity in the 1960s. And one example here is the writing of Josef Raban, a key writer on industrial design and applied arts at the time. And he offers another interpretation for folk in the design context. So first of all, he says traditional folk art, manufacture and handcraft play a triple role. They constitute a stimulus to inspiration, a yardstick of quality and culture value, and a contrasting element to industrial production. And the yardstick is interesting in this kind of need to make everything a science, this kind of idea of quantitative measurement. But it's also this idea, whilst it's shrouded in kind of some official speak, I think it's the kind of integration that he's hoping for, rather than the kind of socialist realist juxtaposition that we saw in the tabor architecture, which can be seen coming into fruition in the late 1960s. And also he's trying to find some kind of individuality. He wants to exclude works which, due to mass production, the author's original designs being generalised to the point of anonymous, notwithstanding their important role in the economy and culture of everyday life. So it's still a kind of official rhetoric that he's speaking, but he's trying to find this place where there's some kind of author individuality, and he sees folk as being connected to this still. But this kind of idea of integration and trying to integrate these forms, I think perhaps most successfully does happen in this dress by Milada Jochova in 1968, made by Olav, who we discussed before. And this is using the very traditional form of blueprint fabric, of vernacular material and technique, but rather than covering it with embroidered birds or other kind of peasant motifs, it has this splashed paint and it becomes a kind of fashionable 1960s experimental piece of clothing. So perhaps here folk is being explored in a material way, in an integrated way rather than an imposed way. But obviously note the date, this is 1968. So unfortunately, this is kind of a peak point of this sort of real integration. And after the shocking events of the Prague Spring and the invasion of the troops, Czechoslovakia entered the ideologically restrictive period known as normalization. And in some forms, we see the return of these strange juxtapositions which Hašek was criticizing. And I call this image, which was part of a series of situational pictures for teaching around what is the home, made in 1971 by Ladislav Čech. I sort of think of this as the plonked granny, because right in the middle you can see, even though it's a kind of socialist modernist room with its, what people would say is Brussels-style late 1950s furniture, And we have, and potentially a kind of prefabricated flat, we have a kind of rustic grandmother figure in her folk shawl and her scarf, and she's sewing. And she's the kind of symbol of home, but she's also an anachronism in this place. And I think it's this kind of jumbling together of images that Hašek is kind of criticising. And it's no coincidence that also at this time we see a resurgence of interest in folk images and the making of a new version of Babička, the film based on the book by Božena Němcová, who wrote this in 1855. It was a kind of key motif of Czech national awakening in the 19th century. So perhaps at this point Hašek's film takes on relevance again in the early 1970s, so 10 years later we can query this relationship to ethnographic practices and how it's used by the state as a political tool, and come back to this quote from a director of a local museum who says in the film Moravské Helles, "Ethnography is at its end, everything has perished, and only exceptionally do we succeed in finding something like it. It seems to me like a slowly dying cow at the end of its tether, and everyone jumping on her to get a last drop of milk off her. And this poor animal is not even milk-giving but blood-shedding, and with the last drop of its blood feeds us all, the filmmakers, the TV people, researchers, professors and museum deputies, and I don't know who else yet." This idea of kind of pulling it for all it's worth, rather than that subtle integration that we saw in the Ulov dress. So Moravské Helles, as I hope I have demonstrated today, interrogates what the maker becomes in an extreme ideological context. In Hašek's opinion, they can often become meaningless, carrying out the actions just of the state. But also, they don't take these actions so seriously. They get drunk and they do what they're supposed to, but it's a kind of thing they're not taking so seriously. But what he most importantly shows is this incredible importance of craft making and local traditions to culture and political debate. The tension and dynamics around craft and folk motifs was vital to the wider cultural discourse around issues such as alienation and bureaucracy. And these are readily seen in contemporary literature, art and philosophy, but socialist design models also offer a place to interrogate the central themes of the communist project. And Hašek obviously struck a chord, and his arrow went to the heart of a question about meaning in the bureaucratic machine, and the fact that the state did not like this is evidence of how important making was as a political issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
Great.
And we're
That's two really.
I'm going to be typing Kit as well at the same time, so I learn from your questions.
My question was, I mean, at some stage you're going to this is a PhD in process, is it?
Yes.
Yeah. And at some stage you're going to, this will be a monograph, I imagine.
It would be great if it was, yeah.
I was just thinking about...
I mean, not a monograph because it's not completely focused on Hašek, but...
Oh, right,
yes,
yeah.
Yes.
Okay. But it'll be a book.
I hope so.
And it's an amazingly kind of detailed, authoritative study of something that's quite localized in the best possible way. Localized was very important. How would you find kind of points of reference outside? I mean, you mentioned it towards the end, the sort of 1968 uprising and so forth. But I was thinking that when you talk about kitsch, there's some parallel debates going on in the States with Greenberg's essay on art and kitsch. You've got the kind of current of socialist realism. So you've got a debate going on both sides of the Atlantic, and a debate between Greenberg and who sees that, as you know, that kind of socialist realism as being the antipathy of freedom in art. And then you've got the kind of craft element going on, and craft being articulated through film. And I just wondered, when you're thinking about the book, how would you what's your feeling about finding links outside so that somebody reading it would actually see this as a really important part of a bigger picture?
Good question, thanks. Well, so this, I guess maybe knowing a bit more about the structure would help with that. This was going to be part of chapter 2, but I think now it's going to be part of chapter 1, where it looks and exposes the kind of central themes. Then what I then have are 3 central areas of case study. So I have ceramics, glass and textiles, and I'm looking specifically at one or two makers within those different areas, one for ceramics, two for glass, and one for textiles. And I'm looking at how they, as makers, were drawing upon and working with their ideological context, but the kind of influences that they were potentially looking at outside. And one of the key things in the glass section, for instance, is that they were exporting objects to America, and they were also part of international trade fairs, so they were being exposed to what's going on. But and then there's another section which is also looking very much at the type of discourse and material that was being published in magazines like Domov, which were reviewing and looking at international influences. But then I suppose also as a historian, I'm also then trying to read it through other writing that's going on around, like David Crowley with Poland and Greg Castillo with Germany, and so trying to kind of find a place of comparison. But yeah, there's a big debate going on around kitsch in the 1930s, and there's in the Czech context, and obviously that's kind of connecting to and tying in with the American debate as well.
Also, as you were talking, I was thinking about parallel debates that are going on in France at the time, tensions between sort of what was seen as Jewish modernism and a more authentic, what was seen to be a more authentic local culture centred around craft. And it comes out of some of there was the fascist movement that developed in France, which is very strong in the late 1920s, particularly throughout the 30s, was I'm sure you know this anyway, was sort of stridently anti-modernist, but they embraced stuff which is very much like some of the craft that you're talking about.
Okay.
So you've got a kind of, it's quite chilling reading actually.
Yeah.
Stuff.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. I mean, I suppose I'd been being led by the material. I'm ending up in kind of Hungary, Poland, Russia, Japan, Vietnam, Scandinavia, and Britain. Those are the places there. But I hadn't looked at France.
But being led by the material, it comes back to the discussion we were had earlier about methodology.
Exactly.
Is interesting because that's a perfectly credible way to follow a story in research, is to see where the material takes you.
Where it takes you. Yeah, and I suppose the thing that I've wrestled a lot with this is that it's such an enormous territory, and where do I start? So I suppose my methodology is thinking of kind of key events and points from which I can unpack, and having to be led by those. But thank you, that's interesting.
I mean, the interesting thing with the stuff in France, you know, when you, I mean, Antoine will know this, you know, when you go on holiday and stay in a cheap 2-star hotel, and the furnishing, they have this kind of bomb-proof furniture that dates from, it's made in the 1920s and 30s, but it harks back to the period of the early 17th century of Henry IV, Henri IV. There's a big revival of 17th century style furniture in the 1920s and 30s as a riposte to international, what was seen as Jewish modernism.
Right.
Because this stuff is so well made.
It lasts.
It's everywhere. You know, so in the 1990s, when I was staying in 2-star hotels a lot, it was everywhere.
Has that had any kind of retro contemporary revival?
I don't think so.
No.
It hasn't.
It's just there.
You see it everywhere in junk shops, in brocante, and
Absolutely.
it's just so durable.
Yeah.
There's a huge amount of it, and it's undestroyable, so it just lasts very, very long, and people just
and it's
keep
made of oak
using them.
as well, so
Wow.
it's bomb-proof.
Yeah.
It's quite an interesting thing because on a completely different context, in Brazil in the 1940s, 1950s, there was this group of artists, painters, people working who were doing very much formalist work with sort of very sort of high sort of great connections to European modernism, formalism, and geometrical kind of formalism, but who at the same time were drawing on folk art. So you see, for instance, images of sort of folk festivals. So the thematics were derived from folk, Brazilian folk, but the forms were this bizarre sort of high modernist stylization of folk. I don't know if that, but again, within the discourse, it was completely different from any of that, because it was not a discourse of fascism, but instead a discourse of high modernism, aesthetically, and also politically. The political modernism, the liberal aspect of modernism. So quite sort of different sort of context for all
That's
that.
really interesting.
These different uses of folk art within modernist context, either for or against it.
Yeah.
Has there been a conference on folk art as a kind as the other side of modernism?
There must have been, but I don't know of one. I mean, I suppose there was the more contained kind of folk exhibition that was at Tate Britain.
That was only a year ago.
That was a year ago.
A year, 2 years ago.
Yeah, but that didn't really. Don't remember whether it kind of talked about connections to modernism, or that was more kind of like outsider.
Yeah, I think that was more sort of an outside folk kind of thing. More the kind of thing that Jeremy Della, for instance, would do, rather than draw connections between cultural, that sort of
it's more
larger scale cultural.
Yes, exactly.
I just need to make a quick phone call. I've got a meeting to go to. This is far more important and interesting, so I'm going to let them know I'm going to be a bit late.
Oh, thank you.
We can keep that on the phone.
I found the presentation quite interesting. From somebody who isn't at your level, you know, I'm only doing my MA, I've only just started it, so really I've only just finished my BA. But, you know, I did manage to absorb quite a bit of the information that you were bringing to the room. And one thing that struck me, which is, I think, as relevant today as it's ever going to be, is this idea of authenticity. This genuine, where does it come from? Is it believable in that, you know, it's trusted by the artist because he believed in it or she believed in it, is therefore exposing itself to an audience because it is genuinely authentic. And how that comes across in folk art as a mass-produced economic machine, you know, by lots of different people, you know, a formalised plan of authenticity from our country, you know. And I thought that's quite fascinating on a mass scale when many of us are trying to do it on a single scale.
Scale.
So there's a big comparison there and sort of delivering that authenticness to get a whole country to produce it, and yet as an individual artist that is such a hard thing to do. If I may sort of you know, I'm sure you are very aware that this discourse of authenticity has a very, very, very long history in the history of ideas, in art, in philosophy, and it goes back to Romanticism. And was it Adorno who wrote the thing of authenticity? I forgot the name of the book. I didn't prepare. A critique of of a discourse on authenticity, and it's something that has been very often reclaimed by, firstly, fascist movements in relation to folk culture as being an expression of authenticity within a people
right? With
Yeah,
a national, with a national gives some base.
It is a tool to bring people
So
to
you kind
one
of
way
see
of
the
thinking,
connection
isn't it?
between that
Yeah.
and some strains of fascism.
Yeah.
And in the socialist context, in the sort of Soviet model, then trying to make a science out of that.
Yeah.
So the ideal situation in that context being that you would make a perfect formula that could be
Yeah,
reproduced.
I just find that really, you know, only because this morning, I was telling Stephen this morning that I read this document today on an artist, and I spent literally 2 hours trying to put 150 words together of what I really wanted to say. And the one thing that came out was this authenticity. So I'm just fascinated that, you know, a whole country could produce this folk art as an economic model, you know, sell it to the people as an authentic way to show the authenticity and genuineness and the history of our country, you know, and yet as an artist, just to make one single authentic object is...
Yeah, and I think you've put your finger on the issue, which is why I'm also looking at the case studies are kind of, you know, like interviewing individual makers as well, and in their studios and saying what did this mean on a day-to-day level, because obviously that's the kind
I personally, I've come to the conclusion now that in order to produce a truly authentic piece of work, there are certain criteria you really have to understand. The materials, why you've chosen those materials, what they convey, and all these kinds of things. The form, why that form. You know, and what is your knowledge of that subject? You know, is it just skim the surface, or is it really embedded in your brain? You really know about it. You know?
And there's people I'm interested in. I mean, right now people like Richard Sennett.
Right.
Maybe you've read his The Craftsman, and these are kind of ideas of craft theory.
We were discussing that yesterday, weren't we?
And Glenn Adamson and these characteristics that you've been saying, skill and authenticity and time and materiality and how do those there's a lot of writing about that right now and kind of how we approach that, especially this kind of craft renaissance that we're going through right now. But how do those kind of terms play out in a really complicated political system?
I should imagine in quite a powerful way.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.